911, do you have an emergency?
Hi, yes, there's somebody stuck in a sewer over here on Atlantic.
The murder case that started with a missing person report at first. No one thought it was serious. Someone hadn't shown up.
In rural Michigan, a search for a missing man ends in cold-blooded murder.
Calls weren't answered, messages left unread. It felt like one of those situations that would resolve on its own. But then a report was filed, and once investigators started looking closer,
And bring his killer to justice.
things didn't feel right. The timeline had gaps. Simple questions didn't have clear answers. And the people closest to the situation seemed just a little off. Not enough to accuse, but enough to notice.
It never made sense to me at all.
Why Audrey Griffin didn't stand a chance.
He's a vicious animal.
Something was very off that night. He was so aggressive.
The wife of the man who murdered the 19-year-old
He was on his way to kill you.
reveals his life of violence.
They should have put him in jail after breaching his second AVO.
What began as a routine missing person case slowly shifted into something far more complex, because the deeper they looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just someone who disappeared. Something had happened, and someone knew exactly what it was. At the beginning, everything followed a familiar pattern. A report was filed. Basic details were collected. Investigators documented the last known contact, the time the person was last seen, and any recent changes in behavior. On the surface, it looked like a situation they had handled many times before. Someone unaccounted for, possibly by choice, possibly temporary. But even in those early moments, there were small details that didn't sit right. The timeline felt incomplete. Usually, in missing person cases, there's a clear sequence: where the person was, who they spoke to, what they were doing before they disappeared. Here, those details existed, but they didn't connect smoothly. There were gaps. Moments that seemed unclear or slightly inconsistent depending on who was asked. At first, that wasn't unusual. People remember things differently, especially under stress. But as investigators revisited those same details, the inconsistencies didn't fade. They became more noticeable. The last known movements of the missing person became the focal point: where they had been, who they had interacted with, what their plans were. Every step was mapped out carefully, and that's when something stood out. The final confirmed interaction. It wasn't dramatic. No obvious signs of conflict. No witnesses describing anything alarming. Just a moment that, on its own, didn't seem significant, but it was the last point where everything was certain. After that, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no activity, no communication. That silence became important because in most cases, even if someone chooses to leave voluntarily, there are traces. Financial activity, phone signals, some form of movement that can be tracked. Here, there was none, which raised a difficult question. Was this really a disappearance or something else? As investigators expanded their scope, they began speaking more closely with the people who had been in contact with the missing individual. Friends, family, anyone who could provide context. And that's when the tone of the investigation began to shift, not because of what people said, but because of how they said it. There were subtle inconsistencies, changes in wording, details that seemed to evolve over time. Nothing strong enough to prove deception, but enough to suggest that not everything was being shared fully. That's a critical moment in any investigation, because it introduces a new possibility, that the answers aren't out there somewhere. They're already in the room. At this stage, investigators started focusing less on where the missing person might be, and more on what might have happened before they disappeared. The environment became important. Locations were revisited, not just to search, but to understand, to reconstruct movements, to identify what could have occurred without being immediately visible. And once again, small details began to surface, things that might not have meant much initially, but now carried more weight when placed into context. A timeline adjustment, an object out of place, a detail that didn't align with earlier statements. Individually, none of these proved anything, but together, they began to form a pattern. And that pattern pointed in a direction investigators couldn't ignore. This was no longer just about finding someone. It was about understanding whether a crime had already taken place, which meant the investigation had crossed a line from search to suspicion, from absence to possibility, and once that shift happens, everything changes because now every detail isn't just information, it's potential evidence. And every person involved isn't just a source. They could be hiding something. At this point, investigators knew one thing for certain. The truth wasn't going to be found by looking further away. It was going to be found by looking closer, much closer, once the investigation crossed that line. From searching to suspecting, everything became more focused. The timeline was rebuilt again, but this time with a different objective. Not just to understand where the missing person had been, but to identify where the story stopped making sense. Investigators went back over every statement, every interaction, every small detail that had previously been accepted at face value. And that's when the cracks started to show. Details that once sounded consistent, no longer aligned, timings shifted slightly. Explanations became more complicated instead of clearer. That's often the moment when a case begins to reveal its true shape, because the truth is usually simple. It doesn't need adjustments. It doesn't change depending on who tells it. But something here was changing, and investigators could see it. The focus narrowed to the last confirmed location, the place where the missing person had been before everything went silent. It was revisited, not just as a point on a map, but as a scene that needed to be understood in detail. Search efforts became more targeted, not broad sweeps, but precise examinations. And then something was found, not immediately obvious, not dramatic, but significant enough to raise serious concern. It suggested that whatever had happened hadn't happened somewhere far away. It had happened close, very close. At that point, the investigation shifted again. This time into full criminal inquiry, forensic teams became involved. Evidence was collected, documented, and analyzed. Every surface, every object, every overlooked detail was treated as something that could hold answers. And slowly, those answers began to emerge. What once looked like a disappearance started to take on a different form, a sequence of events, a moment of conflict, an attempt to control what happened next, and most importantly, an effort to hide it, because that's what ultimately gave it away. Not the act itself, but what followed. Attempts to explain things that didn't need explaining, movements that didn't match the timeline, noxers that only made sense if something was being concealed. And once investigators saw that clearly, everything connected. The person who had last been in contact with the missing individual was no longer just part of the story. They were at the center of it. At first, they maintained their version of events, calm, controlled, consistent, at least on the surface. But as the evidence grew stronger, that version became harder to hold because facts don't shift. And eventually, the weight of those facts became undeniable. The confrontation wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The evidence spoke for itself, and in that moment, the case that had started as a missing person report finally revealed what it had been all along. A murder. The arrest that followed didn't just answer the question of where the missing person was. It answered something deeper, what really happened, and why it had taken time to uncover. For the people involved, the truth brought a kind of clarity, but not relief. Because knowing what happened doesn't erase it. It just replaces uncertainty with reality. And for investigators, it was a reminder of how quickly a case can change, how something that looks routine can become something far more serious, all because of one thing, a detail that didn't fit, a feeling that something wasn't right, and the decision to keep looking, because if that moment had been ignored, this story might have ended very differently. If this story made you realize how quickly something ordinary can turn into something much darker, how important it is to question the details that don't quite fit, then you're seeing what most people miss. Because the truth doesn't always stand out. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. So if you want more real cases, deeper breakdowns, and stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who won't expect it, and subscribe to the channel, because the next case might start just as quietly.